Believe it or not, interview fear is actually something quite common and quite natural. Why is it natural? Simply because the best possible interview is also the least predictable ones. And the second reason why interview is so unnatural is because it's a relatively new behavior for human beings. It was only invented about 100 years ago. Now, how do you overcome this fear? And what can you do to perform at your best during an interview? I have two methods for this, and I'll start with the boring one, if I may call it so. That is to prepare for an interview. I know this from experience. I know countless of examples of people who said, "Then I'm really scared of that interview," and the more I dived into their preparation process, the more I realized they did not actually prepare at all for that interview. So preparation works for a job interview. Now, what are some of the more interesting pitfalls with preparation for a job interview? By far the most interesting of those is when you prepare for an interview and you prepare on something you're already good at. In other words, you prepare what you feel the most comfortable preparing for. So instead, of preparing what you might have a certain fear of, right? So, for example, developers might have a fear of behavioral questions, or there are developers who are great speakers and prefer to prepare the behavioral part instead of the technical part of an interview. But this one thing, self-assessing yourself and knowing what you cannot do, what you can't. This is one of the interesting ones. Another one would be for this preparation process to avoid coming across as scripted or templated. So, needless to say that there are some candidates who prefer memorizing answers to most commonly asked questions in a job interview. And if you remember what I said in the beginning of this video, the best possible interviews are also the least predictable ones. Whereas if you memorize stuff, that's basically you're calling for trouble here, because immediately, as soon as after you get a question for which you haven't prepared for, you will automatically loop through your script of prepared answer. You won't find anything, and then what happens? Well, then you block. Then fear will overcome you. Very important, and many people don't realize this preparing for an interview, is to be able to role play with someone, or role play even if you record yourself, or even if you speak to yourself in the mirror. You're probably to better self-assess as compared to when just writing down your answer and just overthinking or just thinking about your answers. Or if you want, I also have a website with a free service allowing you to find other candidates preparing for job interviews and to eventually role play with those candidates. But needless to say, these would be the main things you want to keep in mind. Of course, when you prepare for a job interview, don't just prepare the highlights in your career where you were successful, right? Maybe also prepare the least the counterintuitive part, also where you had some challenges, some failures in your career. So again, it's also a little bit linked with fear. So prepare also what's good, but also what's not so good about you. Prepare your weakness. So this would be about the preparation process. I also have a countless number of videos about these things if you wanna check them out. Now the second method to overcome interview fear is during the actual interview. The simple word to define this method would be to lead the conversation. Now, when I'm saying lead the conversation, I also want to add a little bit of explanation here, because leading a conversation means different things to different people, simply because people lead differently. So probably the best possible formula here would be to have an appropriate preparation process in the first place and gain enough confidence for you, to always, gain that confidence during the interview. However, from experience, this doesn't always happen, and people still are genuinely scared of these interviews in spite of their qualification for the job. Now, what happens then? Well, one method that works for me, and one method that I train myself to do, is to just project it out, throw it out there. I simply say it like this, now for the next 1 hour, for the next however long period of time, I must forget about the fear. I must understand that fear is my friend ultimately. And if you think about it, fear is actually your friend, because if you wouldn't have fear, then imagine yourself crossing the street. You would have no fear of any cars, right? So you would actually die if you had no fear. So fear is actually 99% of the time, it's actually something extremely positive in your life and something that's helpful. There's only these certain events where you have the fear of unknown, where fear might overwhelm you. And this is where you want to consider, having an approach to just putting it out there. And the best example I have is, the best reference actually I have is an example from Mike Tyson, actually his coach, Cas D'Amato. Example of a deer in a forest, and she spots a danger, she spots a predator. And that deer is scared, so now that she's scared, instead of jumping 50 feet, she only jumps 40 feet. So needless to say, her performance, her chances of getting away of that danger actually decrease. And this is what happens also in the job interview. So that's why, fear should be interpreted as something as being your friend. And the fear of failing is most of the time an illusion. And again, I'll link that video with Mike Tyson talking about this in the video description. It's quite inspirational if you want to check it out. So again, these would be the main two methods that I would definitely recommend you to employ to overcome this process of fear. First of all, would be to prepare what matters for that specific interview, and then to have a conversation with yourself after all, and to really find your true self, and to be yourself during the interview. And maybe one last thing here, in an interview there's always ups and downs. There's no such thing as perfect answers to any possible questions, as there's no perfect candidate for any job, as there's no perfect job. There's no such thing as a perfect job. So what you also want to keep in mind is, when you have a less interesting answer, or you have no answer at all to a given question, think about what's next. Think about the next question. Think about performing for the next question. Don't just go on a downwards trend, because this will be reflective of a candidate that easily gets discouraged, and a candidate that's not is not ready to get the job done, because I'm assuming you're applying for a good job. So these two elements, preparation and leadership, are basically my formula to overcome interviewing fear.